welcome everybody this afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great honor to be here with you this afternoon and to moderate this first of 3 upcoming panels. In the next 30 minutes, or maybe even more, let's see how we can cope up for the missing Thiago. We want to reflect on the potential of digital public infrastructure and digital public goods and digital cooperation, especially for developing countries. Just let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Katharina Menz. I'm Deputy Head of Division Digital Technologies at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. But I'm now delighted to introduce to you our panelists this afternoon. First of all, we are joined by Christopher Burns, Chief Digital Development Officer and Director for Technology at USAID. And with over 25 years of international development experience, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, Christopher Burns spearheaded the agency's first ever digital strategy in 2020. He has a collection of African arts and wooden stools, and Christopher, to be honest, I cannot imagine anything of a bigger contrast between wooden stools and digital public infrastructure, but maybe we can discuss on that later. Thank you, and welcome, Christopher Burns. And as you already heard, unfortunately, Thiago Carneiro can't be with us today because of an emergency. So I ask for your understanding that we only have 2 panelists. But nevertheless, I'm very delighted, last but not least, from the European to introduce to you Bin Adjeminian, Deputy Head of Unit A3 at the European Commission's DG NEAR. Ben was previously the head of cooperation for the EU delegation to Armenia and head of infrastructure section in Benin, and has extensive experience in public-private partnerships in Asia. A warm welcome also to you. So let's get right down to business. Over the past years, we've already heard it, digital public infrastructure and digital public goods have emerged as key drivers of an inclusive and equitable digital transformation. Still, sometimes it seems to me that there are already more definitions to the term DPI in this world than actually DPI on the ground implemented. Maybe we can work out on this also. However, this year, both DPI and DPGs have taken center stage on a global level, including the G20 and the culmination of the DPG Charter campaign. And the UN, as we've already heard, have even selected digital public infrastructure as one of the high-impact initiatives that can accelerate our achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So, first question to you, Christopher, what makes the DPG-DPI approach so relevant to developing countries, and why is it an attractive way of digital development from a donor perspective?
Thanks, Katharina, and good afternoon, everyone. And it's great to have GovStack back on the agenda at the Tallinn Digital Summit, and thank you again for inviting USAID back to discuss it and to really embrace the momentum that you just highlighted, Katharina, and that Nele and Doreen talked about as well. And I may be a bit biased, and perhaps there are a number of biased folks in this room when we think about the role that DPGs and DPI play in development. And if I were to frame it of why it's important to what we do, perhaps I'll start with a hypothetical example. Tell me when you've heard a version of this before. Doreen alluded to it a little bit in her remarks. But let's say you have a tech vendor that shows up at a line ministry and says, I've got a tech product for you that's going to solve all of your use cases. Tell me what they are and I'll build it. And that line of ministry might be the Ministry of Community Development or Urban Planning. And at the same time, another tech vendor shows up at the Ministry of Ag and says, I've got a tech product for you. Maybe it's the same tech provider with a different tech solution, joining and having a conversation with the agricultural experts. That's also happening at the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Economic Development, et cetera, et cetera. Each of those ministries purchases their tech solution sends their bill to the Ministry of Finance. They have different codes for all of them. The Ministry of Finance isn't tracking each one of those, but pays it out. And at very little point in time is the Ministry of ICT or Digital Transformation engaged in that process. This is a common scenario, right? It's happening in countries all over the world. This model is not one of digital transformation. This is a model of digital entrenchment, where stasis creeps in and projects are overridden by costs and costs surmount, and there's very little incentive to innovate or to be transparent about the tech purchases being made. Or perhaps even those tech purchases were made based on cost alone, where the cheapest product was something that a ministry wanted at that point in time. Again, this is happening all over the world. And so when we think about digital transformation, the reason why digital transformation is even on the agenda today and is a very real thing, where just a few years ago, pre-COVID, early COVID, there wasn't much talk about it. There was still talk about the promise of a digital revolution, but no reality of a digital transformation. Back then, we had ministries of ICT. Now we have ministries of digital transformation. We have digital ambassadors and cyber ambassadors. And the reason we have that, I believe in part, is because of digital public infrastructure and digital public goods and the role that they are playing. And yes, DPGs have existed for years. We just called them different things. And digital public infrastructure has existed for years. We just referred to it as payments and identity and data interoperability. And it wasn't until the likes of GovStack and then Digital Public Goods Alliance and others said, hey, when we talk about reusable digital building blocks, we are actually embracing this reality of digital transformation. And when we talk about rolling out reusable digital building blocks for service delivery in countries that have never done so before, we're not just talking about digital transformation, we're talking about an accelerated digital transformation. And so when we think about it from a donor perspective of why that's so appealing to us, for USAID, for others in the room, dear colleagues who are in the business of driving impact across sectors, across communities, we actually embrace this idea of digital transformation, but not as an end game, but because of the implications for societal transformation. And so I think about the power here, but I have to just end with an asterisk, an if. There was a lot of conversation this morning, and we're going to hear it throughout today, and it's a theme that resonates across Talon Digital Summits year to year, this idea of trust. This idea of taking what's available in digital services and embedding that trust and embedding the safeguards into how it's rolled out to make sure that communities, citizens, underserved and marginalized populations can really believe in those digital services that a government is offering, to make sure that we've built in the safeguards that drive human rights, that understand this role of data privacy and protection, that build in cybersecurity from the beginning and all the way through. If we don't have that built in, we're just talking about DPIs in a vacuum. And so I'd like to think, again, because of how GovStack has come about, because of this upswell of recognition of the role that DPIs and DPGs play in driving development, it's that human element, that trust element that we're actually bringing in very intentionally into how we roll out these services that really allow a donor and other partners to, I think, embrace this moment in time and recognize its capacity to completely reach our development goals in a way unlike ever before.
Thank you, Christopher. That was very passionate. And you talked about trust in this context. And when it comes to trust, maybe also shared values are another important aspect. And so many DPI initiatives like GovStack are built on those shared values, and values shared also by the EU, such as openness and human centricity. So, Ben, what does the EU have to offer to this ecosystems of digital public goods and digital public infrastructure?
So good afternoon. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Quite a wide question. I think we had a lot of panel that demonstrated the added value of the EU, so I will not go over what our commissioner, the different ministers from the EU presented. It's clear with 27 member states, there's a lot of learning, there's a lot of building blocks, put them in GovStack. We have IDAS, GDPR, interoperability framework. But in addition to all these building blocks, I think us, the EU, we also 50% are official development assistance, and this is quite important. And we are key development partners. So what do we have to offer? Maybe before we jump to offer, what are the constraints to the authors? Maybe to build on what my colleague was saying before, there is a different myth that we have to break. And it's not only a myth that we have to break coming from the private sector, but I see as a donor, I've been a donor for working in different countries, managing different corporation portfolio. I've seen the donors and us also. I can also see myself, the Commission, with the diversity of the Commission. We have competing objectives, and sometimes some of the objectives are to develop one product in one ministries, one little thing, because of visibility, because it's sellable, because we want to do it. Like election, it's very important election. You save democracy, but do you think about building the EID when you do the election? No, it's so important. We move on the election, we put 40 million euro, we should restructure the whole thing. So yes, on one hand, you do have the vendor that sells solution, but on the other hand, and this is why this partnership and GovTech is so important, we as donor have clearly to be more structured in a way, and not to run thin or to abuse the limited capacity of any administration to reform. I think it's very important. Money is one thing, but you only have a limited capacity to reform. And if you focus the reform on the little digital goods that you can do, or services coming from us donors, and I can tell you in every country we're working, we manage hundreds of projects where we do little goods, and you have the vendors, then the transformation doesn't happen. So we have to really come back to the core. What are the core? What are the structure? The registries, the data, the interoperability. And there we have a lot to give. I think another issue we have, and an issue I had for a long time when I was managing cooperation in Armenia, jointly with Eva on different topics, and governance, for example, is that, yes, it's important to have a Ministry of ICT. Yes, it's important to have a Ministry of Digital Transformation. But actually, sometimes it doesn't help. It doesn't help because digital is an enabler. E-governance, it's public administration reform. First is leveraging digital to bring a transformation. Transformation of societies, businesses in digital, it's first economic growth, SME policies, and then is how do I leverage the digital. So there's a role when we're coming back to the role of the EU. Yes, we do have a lot of building blocks, and I'm really happy. Yes, we are with USA, World Bank, we major partners, so we have the capacity also to fully drive and focus back digital as an enabler and not digital per se, because that will not work. And we need to get together. We need to get together and to have this shared understanding, because donors often compete to give money. There's a limited absorption capacity, but we all want to have a fancy project. We all want to have visibility, and this doesn't help to focus on the core issue, registries, data, interoperability, that are sometimes less visible. So I would say a pledge from us. So I'm working in DG NEAR, so I'm following the digital, among other things, policies in the countries around the EU, and us, we really want to have a big chunk of our engagement digital on the core issues, knowing that we will have to tackle also little things that disperse and respond to political needs. Nice public good doesn't help, but us as a key development partners and partners in this part of the world, we should ensure that our partners and ourselves are focused on the core issues. So the digital public infrastructure, and not only the goodies or the side good that make everyone lose focus. Because maybe to conclude, what I learned through my small journey in development is that money is often not a key issue, but the capacity to reform is limited. The capacity to reform is much more limited than the capacity to find money for transformation. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy that D4D, Digital for Development, it's a platform where the EU is engaging jointly, Commission, Member State, all together, and we try to bring this transformation. We engage also with GovTech and different partners, and I think this partnership and this awareness of focusing on the core is probably what we can bring and what we should bring.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Let's stick with you, Ben, for a moment. We have clearly seen that there's a momentum these days for digital public infrastructure. But where's this movement going? Will it be sustainable, or is it just a hype, or is it really a game changer? Or in other words, do DPI and DPG maybe even have the potential of creating kind of a level playing field between developed countries on the one hand side and developing countries on the other? Or would this be an exaggeration?
So it's a difficult question, but one thing we're working in the European Commission, if you focus on the optimization of government, e-gov, it's really to use the tool we have developed in public administration reform, and it's often we're working closely with OECD on that one. With Sigma, we have public administration reform principle. We really engage in public administration reform as an institution. It's the core, and we all understand that it's core. And within that vision, we want to embed digital, and not the other way around. So for me, it's very important when I go and talk to the different delegation. I have a colleague from Sarajevo here, where we're working jointly, is to say that it's not digital, it's public administration reform. Digital will allow the change, but it has to be led by Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister office, and not the ICT, except in some countries where they have a power. That really depends on the country. So I would say the hype will to sustain it has to be embedded in the rest. We cannot just see it as an isolation. It's very important. Same thing for education. There's so much big thing about AI, digitalization of education, but we are involved in education. We have been for the last several generations in all the country working on training the teachers, building school, and we have to use this knowledge to embed the digital. So how do we transform ourselves would be the key. So for me, there's a little bit an inward thinking where I really feel that we could team up through the D4D and different initiatives to transform our own institution that engage with partners to say digital is an enabler and not just a fashion, otherwise fashion change.
Chris, we have seen a number of even democratically elected governments being toppled just in these few days and weeks, Mali, Niger, Gambia just days ago. Do these events need to make us rethink what systems to implement and how to do so? Or just let me put it in another way, can DPI and DPG strengthen good governance and thus maybe even enhance the resilience of society? Or would this claim overstretch expectations?
Thanks for that question, Katharina. And I suppose I'll start by building off of your previous one around hype. I think ultimately we are hype men and hype women, and if we do our jobs well, then there is this potential to actually sustain for the longer term the true power of digital public infrastructure, assuming that our partner governments themselves embrace it and recognize that fundamental opportunity and are having their hands in the design of what that looks like. And certainly, as a donor, we are in the business of bringing new voices to the table to make sure that they are the ones themselves building those DPIs accordingly. It's actually one of the biggest motivations that we, alongside many in this room, started the Digital Public Goods Charter effort to make sure that we were crowding in those voices and commitments and pledges to make sure that digital public goods and the infrastructure that underlies it ultimately works for them. I think there's a component there when we talk about the role of good governance and resilience as well, beyond what is happening in West Africa and elsewhere in the world in terms of administration changes, non-democratic ones. We know that when we're talking about the impact of digital public infrastructure, the long tail that it brings forward. Obviously, there's a lot of attention, for great reason, on DIA these days, and what a wonderful suite of tools it has been for ensuring that Ukrainian resiliency. But there was a lot of investment that predated the app itself. And USAID and our partners in the UK and the Eurasia Foundation actually had been working with Ukraine, even before the Ministry of Digital Transformation existed in its current form, to, in effect, put together digital public infrastructure that now underpins DIA, including their platform of registries. And so even back 6-7 years ago, I think there was an acknowledgement among many really taking stock of the strong ICT sector that Ukraine already had to put these reusable building blocks in place that has now resulted in what is DIA, and one that continues to grow, introduced pre-war, but adapting and evolving for times of war, with new services being offered all the time. And so I think that's something that has been really core to USAID and making sure that our partner governments are embracing these tools to meet their own development objectives. We're actually now working beyond Ukraine, including in Moldova. Many of you may have heard Deputy Prime Minister Aleba in his remarks this morning talking about their Evo app that hopefully will be launched sometime this fall. USAID is working with them to, again, make sure that the right digital public infrastructure is in place for an Evo to flourish. And even beyond that, what was announced by our administrator, Samantha Power, earlier this year is a desire to take a DIA-like offering to other partner countries around the world. Not the app itself, but again, the idea of what digital public infrastructure allows for an app like DIA to flourish. And so in May, we did announce that we're going to start that process alongside Ukraine's Ministry of Digital Transformation, partners in the Eurasia Foundation, and others, including some to still be named, to explore that opportunity in Colombia, in Zambia, in Kosovo. We're in active conversations with other countries because of this exact point, Katerina. When we talk about resilience, when we talk about good governance, and I should note that Ukraine, the reason that they actually put DPIs into place to begin with was this idea around good governance, transparency, accountability, starting out in procurement, moving into the construction industry, and then beyond to say, look, we want to demonstrate to our citizens what it means to be accountable, what it means to be transparent in how we are spending money. And I think at this point in time, if we are talking about true good governance, if we are talking about resilient nations, this is one element to it. It's not the only element, but I don't think at this point in time we can actually talk about it in the absence of acknowledging the role that digital public infrastructure plays and the opportunities through DPGs in terms of liaising with the citizenry and meeting the needs of the communities and where they want to get to.
Thank you very much, Chris. And actually, though we had 33% less panelists than originally planned, time is already up. So what just is left for me is just to thank you both for joining us today, and over to you, Ivor, and 2 more panels to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you.